1915, the second year of the Great War. Leaders in London and Paris were looking for a shortcut. Strike the Ottoman Empire, open the Dardanelles, resupply Russia, and perhaps bring down what many call the sick man of Europe. Target: a strip of land 50 miles long and 12 miles wide, the Gallipoli Peninsula at the mouth of the Dardanelles. It controls the passage to the Sea of Marmara into Constantinople. Against Ottoman troops, advised by Germans, comes an army from many lands: British, French, Anzac Australians and New Zealanders, Indian units, North Africans, Senegalese. From April 1915 to January 1916, to hold or seize those coastal hills, the Allies lost over 250,000. The Ottomans, about the same. In all, 500,000 were put out of action. The campaign hardened into trenches, bombardments, bloody raids, and dawn assaults against wire and machine guns. Each push cost hundreds of lives for gains of a few hundred yards. How did so many lives get sacrificed for a peninsula that, in the planners' minds, was meant as the quick move to shorten the war? At the outbreak of war in 1914, the Ottoman Empire was still formally neutral. It was a tired empire. It had lost provinces, its army needed rebuilding, and the economy was fragile. In Constantinople, the Young Turks sought a way to strengthen the state and keep it from collapse. To succeed, they desperately needed a great power as an ally. They found it in Berlin. Germany offered military instructors, naval advisors, modern weapons, and financial credit. In the summer, 2 German cruisers, Goeben and Breslau, evaded the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean and took refuge in Constantinople. They changed their names to fly the Ottoman flag, yet still remained in practice under German command. At the end of October 1914, those ships bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea. The response was immediate. Russia, France, and Great Britain declared war on the Ottoman Empire. From that moment, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles were closed. Russia was cut off from supplies and exports. Without Russian grain and vital industrial materials, London feared a crisis at home. And on the Eastern Front, the Russian army seemed at risk of buckling under the war's weight. That is why, in 1915, the idea arose to strike at the Straits. If the Ottoman defenses along the Straits could be broken and Constantinople brought under threat, the route to Russia could be reopened and the Central Powers deprived of an ally in a single blow. Against this backdrop, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, pressed for a naval solution, a great fleet forcing the Straits to open the road to Constantinople. Turning those plans into orders was General Sir Ian Hamilton, commanding the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force with French counterparts beside him. Facing them was the Ottoman Fifth Army under the German officer Lehmann von Sanders and the Young Turk leader Enver Pasha, determined to prove that the empire could still resist and to restore its national prestige at home and abroad. Before risking a landing, the Allies tried to win with ships alone. From February and March 1915, Allied squadrons entered the Dardanelles to batter the Ottoman forts, sweeping mines by night and exchanging fire by day across the narrow channel. It was Churchill's operation. Admiral John de Robeck led the fleet, while General Ian Hamilton prepared the landing force. On the other side stood the Ottoman Fifth Army under the German leader Lehmann von Sanders. Minefields and mobile batteries guarded the strait's tight turns and headlands from the hidden positions. Initial bombardments knocked out several posts, and in London, hopes of a swift victory rose. On 18 March, the great attempt came. French battleships led, British dreadnoughts followed, and the fleet drove into the Narrows. But under the water waited fresh mine lines. Within hours, the French Bouvet capsized. HMS Irresistible and HMS Ocean were lost. Other ships were damaged. The fleet withdrew, badly battered, and confidence cracked. By evening, the strait was closed. The plan to force the Dardanelles with a navy alone had failed. Losses were high, forts stood, and mines were relayed. If the straits were to open, soldiers had to go ashore.
Did you know that most people who watch our documentaries aren't subscribed yet? If you enjoy animated maps and history, join our community. Leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next episodes.
On 25 April 1915, at dawn off Gallipoli, more than 120 Allied ships are already in position. Within a few hours, about 70,000 men will be put ashore. British, French, Australians, New Zealanders, and Indian and North African units. On paper, the operation is under Sir Ian Hamilton, but in the chaos of the landings, field commanders matter. At Cape Helles, General Aylmer Hunter Weston leads the British. The French contingent is under General Albert d'Aumale. Farther north, the Australian and New England Army Corps, ANZAC, is commanded by General William Birdwood, a British officer highly esteemed by his men. British planners use codes, not Turkish place names. The beaches at Cape Helles become V, W, X, Y, and S. To the staff, they are only letters on a map. To those stepping from the boats, V and W will mean sand strewn with bodies. At Cape Helles, the British 29th Division and French units come ashore to push for the hills. At places like V Beach, infantry are cut down, trying only to cross about 10 to 15 of shallow water and barbed wire. Farther north, the Anzacs arrive. For many, it is their first contact with Europe. They have crossed more than 12,000 miles of sea from Australia and New Zealand. In 1915, the Corps fields a little over 50,000 men. By the end of the campaign, Australia and New Zealand will count about 34,000 dead and wounded. Opposite them stand about 80 to 90,000 Ottoman soldiers of the Fifth Army. They are no better equipped, but they hold the heights and know the ground. One commander, Mustafa Kemal, immediately sees the critical point above the Anzacs. He halts retreating units, deploys them on the crests, and sends them to meet the Australians and New Zealanders climbing. By evening, the Allies hold only narrow bridgeheads on the coast. The Ottomans have lost entire battalions to block them. The war of maneuver has already become a war of trenches. At the start of summer, the front is almost motionless. Allied troops, British, French, Anzac, Indian, and North African, are compressed into a strip of ground that in many places extends no more than about 1.25 miles inland from the landing beaches. Opposite them, the Ottoman Fifth Army holds the crests, Achi Baba in the south, the heights above the Anzac sector, a chain of hills from which almost every movement can be watched and struck. In some sectors, the trenches are so close that less than 100 feet, about 30 yards, separate one line from the other. At night, hand grenades fly back and forth like balls between two teams. For the Allies, the problem is simple and terrible. Behind them lies the sea. Ahead, the ground rises toward the Ottoman positions. There are no real rear areas. Depots, aid posts, and kitchens all lie within artillery range. The Ottomans, for their part, lack limitless resources, scant supplies, few machine guns, uneven armament. What compensates are altitude and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Oppressive heat, water in short supply, flies everywhere. Bodies left between the lines sour the air and spread diseases that strike Turks and Allies alike. In this environment, the smell of the dead sometimes imposes a truce. On 24 May 1915, after a major Ottoman attack failed before the Anzac positions, the ground between the trenches lay carpeted with corpses. For several hours, the two armies suspended fire to bury them. Australians, New Zealanders, and Ottoman soldiers worked just tens of yards apart, exchanged cigarettes, and studied one another in silence. Then, at the agreed signal, each returned to its trench. The assaults do not cease. The Allies repeatedly attack villages and heights such as Karithia and Achibaba. The Ottomans answer with counterattacks just as bloody. Each time, the balance is the same. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of casualties, only to gain a few dozen or a few hundred meters. In August 1915, the Allies gambled on one last great attempt to unlock Gallipoli. The plan was a pincer, a new landing site at Sulva Bay on the peninsula's northwest coast, while the Anzac pressed for the Sari Bear Heights, with key objectives like Chunuk Bear and Hill 971 anchoring the ridge, in a plan designed to split the Ottoman defenses and open the road inland. Suvla was chosen because the ground looked more forgiving, a broad, sandy bay with low hills within. In the first hours of 7 August, at least 20,000 men of the British 9th Corps came ashore, to grow beyond 60,000 in the following days. On paper, the task was simple: seize the heights around the bay quickly and then push south toward Anzac's lines. In practice, General Frederick Stopford's headquarters, directing the operation from his ship, proved slow and hesitant. Orders arrived late, reconnaissance was scant, and battalions lingered near the shore, while farther east, Australians and New Zealanders climbed toward Sari Bear Ridge. For the Ottomans, it was the most dangerous moment of the campaign. If the Allies took the spine, they could dominate most of the peninsula. The Anafarta sector was entrusted to Mustafa Kemal, who scraped together everything he had: tired battalions, hurried reserves, light guns dragged up the hills. To his men of the 57th Regiment, he spoke the line that became famous: "I do not order you to attack. I order you to die." The New Zealanders managed to raise their flag on Chinook Bear for only a few hours. Other heights changed hands repeatedly among hand-to-hand fighting and night assaults. But Ottoman counterattacks, launched downhill from the crests, in the end drove the Allies back almost everywhere. When the fighting faded, Suvla and the Anzac sector had only gained small salients in exchange for tens of thousands of casualties in just a few days. The last great maneuver failed. Gallipoli remained blocked. With autumn, Gallipoli changes its face. The rains turn the ground to mud and stone. Trenches cut into dry earth filled with water. Shelters cave in. Then the cold arrives. Many on both sides have neither blankets nor proper boots. Frostbite appears. Disease spreads. For the Allies, rough seas often block supply lighters. For the Ottomans, every crate of ammunition must be dragged up slippery slopes under artillery threat. After months of failed assaults, no one sees a real military way out. In the capitals, the verdict is merciless. In London and Paris, the Dardanelles campaign is deemed a blind alley, costly in men and ships. In Britain, responsibility falls on Winston Churchill, for whom the Dardanelles have already cost the Admiralty, and who is pushed to the margins of government. To decide what to do, London sends a new commander, General Charles Munro. His report is glacial. He recommends complete evacuation. Admiral Rosslyn Weymouth is charged with organizing it in secret. At the end of 1915, the evacuation begins. First, the Anzac positions in Suvla Bay sector in the northwest of the peninsula. In January 1916, Cape Helles, too, the southern tip from which the landings had started. The retreat is prepared in detail. Units thinned little by little. Fires left burning. Rifles modified to fire by themselves while the last men embarked in silence. It is the paradox of Gallipoli. The best executed operation is the escape, with minimal losses. For Churchill, that distant peninsula remained a personal wound. In 1916, humiliated, he chose to enlist again and command a battalion on the Western Front, before returning to the political stage as the leader the world would come to know in the Second World War.
And in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
When the last Allied soldier left Gallipoli in January 1916, the reckoning is that of a slaughter. The Allies have suffered more than 250,000 casualties, dead, wounded, and missing. The Ottoman army, a similar number. In all, over 500,000 men were put out of action for a campaign that opened no straits, did not force Turkey from the war, and scarcely altered the balance on the main front in Europe itself. For the Ottoman Empire, however, Gallipoli was a great defensive victory. An army assumed to be weak repelled a coalition of French warships, British infantry, Anzac troops, and colonial units from India and Africa. The name of Mustafa Kemal became the emblem of a new leadership. In the decades that followed, it was seen as one of the foundations of the Turkish Republic. For the Allies, it was a shock. In Britain and France, Gallipoli remained a byword for a plan brilliant on paper, but disastrous on the ground. For Australia and New Zealand, it was where an identity was born. The Anzac Corps became a national myth, and 25 April, Anzac Day, is still a day of remembrance. Decades later, Ataturk, the former enemy, told Anzac mothers, "Your sons now rest here in Turkish soil. They are no longer strangers. They have become and will be our sons." (1916), the third year of the Great War. Politicians and generals promise a decisive victory, the end of the slaughter. In reality, they are preparing a year of great illusions and of the worst carnage imaginable. On the Western Front, a scar runs almost 465 miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. Yet the epicenter of this hell is neither a capital nor a great industrial city, but a small bend of the Meuse around a provincial French town, Verdun. Here, from February 21 to December 1916, Germans and French soldiers butcher one another for a few miles of torn, devastated ground. In all, more than 700,000 men were killed, wounded, or listed as missing. 10 months of fire, mud, and steel for a front line that, in the end, lies almost where it began. French soldiers sum it up this way: "If you have not seen Verdun, you have seen nothing of the war." On this narrow scrap of ground, in barely 5 months, about 30 million shells would fall. In the end, the reckoning is simple and terrible. 6 dead for every 3 yards of line. Long before 1916, Verdun was a symbol. In distant 843, here a treaty was signed that split Charlemagne's empire into 3 kingdoms. 2 of them would become, more or less, France and Germany. In 1792, the fortress of Verdun fell under the blow of the Prussians, at war with revolutionary France. In 1870, it was besieged again in the Franco-Prussian War. Its capitulation opened the road to the French defeat and left a scar on national pride. In 1916, Verdun was a town on the Meuse, sent in a salient, a bulge in the French lines and a dent in the German ones, ringed by around 20 forts. On paper, it was an impregnable stronghold, yet the garrison had about 20,000 men, and many forts were almost empty. Much of the heavy artillery had been moved elsewhere for the 1915 offensives. For Erich von Falkenhayn, it was the perfect target, precious to France, yet exposed enough to be struck from 3 sides. The plan was simple and brutal. Hit Verdun, force the French, for pride more than strategy, to commit their reserves there, then grind them down with artillery in a long battle of attrition. On 12 February 1916, the Germans were ready to strike Verdun. Batteries in position, infantry deployed on both banks of the Meuse. But snow and ice froze the sector. Roads became impassable. Surprise vanished. For days, the troops stayed in shelters while the French, once they grasped the danger, strengthened the sector with new trenches and divisions. At dawn on 21 February, the weather improved. Shortly after 7:15 a.m., about 850 German guns opened fire on the French positions. The bombardment lasted 9 hours. Trenches pulverized, woods uprooted, hills turned into fields of craters. Men and mud became indistinguishable. It was the storm of steel, the deliberate, systematic destruction that industrial war could unleash on roughly 2 miles of front. When the fire slackened, the infantry moved in. The principle was always the same. Artillery conquers, infantry occupies. On a front of 14 kilometers, roughly 9 miles, on the right bank of the Meuse, around 140,000 German infantry advanced in waves under the orders of Crown Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, son of the Kaiser and commander of the Fifth Army, a young officer considered intelligent and backed by an experienced staff. In the Bois de Coeur, just over 1,200 chasseurs under Colonel Émile Giant faced them almost surrounded. They were crushed by fire, but slowed the advance and bought precious hours for the French defense. The Germans were not only more numerous, they also wielded new and deadly weapons. They used flamethrowers on French positions and made extensive use of fighter and reconnaissance aircraft. In their Verdun sector, they concentrated several dozen machines, roughly twice the French strength. Many were the latest generation single-seat fighters with synchronized machine guns firing through the propeller arc. The French replied with Nieuports and other lighter, more maneuverable biplanes, but they were less protected and relied more on rudimentary armament. In the first days, the initiative remained German. Their squadrons ruled the sky over Verdun and covered an advance that by evening had opened a gap up to almost 4 miles, deep in the French lines. The front was shattered, entire units wiped out, yet Verdun had not fallen. Fort Douaumont is the keystone of Verdun's defensive system, the largest fort and the one pushed farthest toward the German lines. On paper, it is the position that must never fall, the concrete and earth anchor of the whole sector. To French planners, it is the cornerstone of the whole shield. Yet after 3 days of bombardment, contradictory reports, and confused orders, on 25 February 1916, it falls almost without a fight. That day, a detachment of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment worked its way up to the fort among shell craters and half-destroyed outworks. Inside, there are very few defenders and almost no heavy artillery. The big guns have been removed months earlier to serve on other fronts. The Germans find open hatches and unguarded entrances, slip inside practically without firing. A single platoon, moving through dark passages and stairways, is enough to seize the bastion that is supposed to symbolize Verdun's resistance. For the garrison, the disaster feels both sudden and absurd to everyone involved. For Berlin, it is a triumph. The breach in the ring of forts seems to fling open the road to the city. Crown Prince Wilhelm of Prussia comes to Douaumont to offer congratulations. Imperial communiques celebrate the fall of the most powerful French fort. For France, it is a brutal blow to morale. The propaganda machine tries to minimize the loss, but in Paris it is obvious that Verdun stands on the edge of disaster. A few months later, in May 1916, an explosion in the ammunition stores inside Douaumont will kill hundreds of German soldiers. The fort, taken almost without a shot, claims its own delayed blood tribute from the occupiers. Meanwhile, the town below is hammered by a huge 15-inch naval gun mounted on a railway carriage. Its shells devastate the center, smash the cathedral, and level entire districts. The civilian population flees inland. Verdun reels and empties, turned into a bleak military landscape. At this point, the French High Command intervenes. General de Castelnau sends a simple order. Not 1 inch of ground is to be given up. Joffre recalls Philippe Pétain, gives him command of the Second Army and the task of holding Verdun at any cost. Commanders repeat, "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass. And Pétain urges his troops on with "Courage, on les aura." Courage, we will beat them. This time, France has decided that Verdun will not fall. Philippe Pétain is an unusual general. Cautious, methodical, little inclined to offensives for honor. He repeats that men must not be thrown against a machine, that fire kills. At Verdun, he turns this idea into a defensive system organized in detail. To withstand the German blow, he starts with supply. He has a country road of 47 miles between Bar-le-Duc and Verdun repaired. It will become the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Along that artery, day and night, up to 6,000 trucks carry ammunition and food. During the battle, 2 million men travel on it, rotated in and out of the sector. Around the town, Pétain has the surviving forts rearmed, restores the batteries, and strengthens artillery positions. The French 75s are joined by heavier pieces able to answer German guns. Divisions are fed into a rotation. Exhausted units are pulled out and replaced by fresher formations. It is not kindness, it is calculation. He knows that if he leaves the same troops too long in that sector, Verdun will give way from nervous collapse before it does from lack of men. In their diaries, the soldiers no longer write, "We are going on the attack," but "We are going to work." Laying barbed wire, digging, repairing trenches, hauling shells through the mud. Day and night blur. Men live among water, earth, rats, and corpses that cannot be recovered. Verdun does not collapse in a single blow. It stiffens and turns into a living fortress fed by trucks, rails, and artillery. The Battle of Attrition, conceived to break France, begins to work, but yard by yard it wears down the German army. On the left bank of the Meuse, the battle focuses on 2 heights, Hill 304 and Mortagne, Dead Man's Hill. The Germans commit 26 divisions and, after months of fighting, takes 1 fort and a few stretches of trench. The hills turn into fields of craters. The geography is erased. The war also moves underground. Both armies dig trenches and galleries, while military miners work beneath no man's land. On the surface, many bodies remain where they fell, because to recover them means exposing oneself to fire. Mud, rats, and decay turn the front into a cemetery where the living share ground with the dead. To artillery and flamethrowers is added phosphine gas, which burns the lungs and kills. Constant bombardments, gas, and machine guns transform Verdun into serial death, compared by historians to an assembly line applied to soldiers' bodies. In this setting comes the drama of Fort Vaux. On 7 June 1916, the Germans launched the final assault in the fort's tunnels. Major Sylvain Reynal's garrison holds out until the water runs out. For 15 days, the men drink urine and lick moisture from the walls. The last call for help is entrusted to a pigeon that crosses the front and dies poisoned. It will receive the Légion d'honneur. Reynal, with no more men or ammunition, surrenders, and the Crown Prince grants him military honors. Fort Vaux falls, but becomes the symbol of Verdun. Hundreds of dead on both sides for a few concrete rooms that are now nothing more than an underground tomb. On 1 July 1916, the Battle of the Somme opens, an Anglo-French offensive designed to ease the pressure on Verdun by forcing the Germans to shift artillery and divisions towards Picardy. On the first day, the British lose 20,000 men, and the German army is hit hard. For Falkenhayn, the problem is clear. He can no longer bleed France white at Verdun without the same time bleeding Germany, between Verdun and the Somme. Losses are too high. Attrition is mutual. By late June, the last German attack on Verdun finally falls. In August, on the Kaiser's orders, Falkenhayn is removed and replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff. The trap designed to break France has now completely closed on the German army. On the French side, after months of defense, command changes. Pétain, the man of Verdun, is promoted. In his place comes General Robert Nivelle, flanked by Charles Mangin, nicknamed the Butcher for his ruthlessness with his troops. The goal is no longer to hold. In the autumn of 1916, the French command prepares a counteroffensive, massing dozens of heavy batteries until the balance of fire, which in February was in German hands, is reversed. On 19 October, the attack begins. In a few days, hundreds of thousands of shells are fired, a density comparable to the German opening of the battle. On 24 October, the infantry moves back into Fort Douaumont, the symbol of the February disaster, taking thousands of German prisoners and capturing dozens of guns along the sector. At the start of November, the Germans, worn down, evacuate Fort Vaux, which the French reoccupy soon afterward. From that moment, a series of limited attacks progressively reduces the German salient at Verdun. After 10 months of fighting, on 19 December 1916, the Inferno of Verdun is finally declared over. By the end of 1916, the reckoning at Verdun is that of a slaughter. 378,000 French casualties, of which 162,000 dead, and 330,000 German casualties, with 143,000 dead. In all, 710,000 lives broken. In just over 5 months, 30 million shells have been fired. Someone will do the math and speak of 6 dead for every yard of front. For the French, Verdun becomes the saved battle. For many Germans, especially after the war, it remains the symbol of an army that was not beaten in the field, but worn down to exhaustion. Around the town, 9 villages erased from the map are never rebuilt, and the Douaumont ossuary gathers the remains of more than 130,000 soldiers, French and German together. Decades later, in 1984, the presidents Mitterrand and Kohl will stand hand in hand in the rain, turning a symbol of war into one of reconciliation. July 1, 1916. At dawn along the Somme River, 750,000 Allied soldiers, British and French, wait for the whistle to signal attack on a front 25 miles long. For a week, their artillery has pounded the German lines. Commanders are convinced almost no one could have survived. On the other side, in trenches and bunkers dug over months, about 300,000 German soldiers wait in silence. They have spent a week under a bombardment that has hurled more than 1 million shells, but thanks to underground shelters, many units remain intact. At 7:30, the British climb from the trenches, advancing at a walk, loaded with full kit. Within a few hours, 58,000 men are hit. Nearly 20,000 die. It is the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, and the front has moved a few dozen yards. For the Germans, that July 1 seems a defensive victory. Yet in the months that follow, the Somme will devour them all. One German officer will call it the grave of our army. How do you lose 1 million men for a handful of miles of mud? At the end of 1915, the Somme was not conceived as a British battle. It was an idea of the French High Command. At Chantilly, General Joffre proposed an offensive in this sector, where the British and French forces met and railways allowed men and guns to be massed. Their plan called for 40 French divisions, roughly 500,000 men, with a more limited British contribution. Then, in February, Verdun exploded. The French divisions promised for the Somme fell from 40 to 5, and in the attack, first scheduled for August, was brought forward to July to ease pressure on the Meuse. Suddenly, the Somme became the trial of strength for the British Army. The British Expeditionary Force was commanded by General Douglas Haig, a cavalry officer convinced that only a great offensive could break the deadlock. The assault on the Somme would be launched by General Henry Rawlinson's Fourth Army, which had to employ the new volunteer formations, Kitchener's New Armies. Here, the British Army was unrecognizable compared with 1914. Before the war, it numbered about 250,000 professionals and 6 infantry divisions designed for colonial wars. By 1916, thanks to the new armies, more than 1 million soldiers were in France, organized into dozens of divisions. Volunteers often recruited in groups from the same town, factory, or neighborhood. They had uniforms and rifles, but little combat experience. On the other side, the sector was held by Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria's army group and, on the ground, by General Fritz von Bellow's Second Army. Over the years, the Germans had turned that rural zone into a deep defense. Trench lines, concrete bunkers, yard-thick belts of wire, and machine gun nests with fields of fire already registered. They knew the attack would come. The idea was simple. Every yard of ground had to be paid for dearly. From June 24, 1916, for 7 days running, the 25 miles of front line on the Somme had turned into a furnace of fire. The Allies unleashed a bombardment that, at its peak, reached 3 rounds a second. More than 1,000 guns hurled over 1 million shells at the German positions. The stated goal was simple and illusory at the same time: to cut the wire, smash the trenches, and bury the machine guns in their nests. But British artillery had 2 serious problems. Many rounds were still shrapnel, shells that burst in the air, throwing a cloud of lead balls designed to cut down men in the open. This kind of ammunition belonged to wars before 1914, when enemies advanced across open fields. Against deep belts of wire and concrete bunkers, it was almost useless. On top of that, up to a third of the shells were duds that failed to explode or went off badly, leaving wire and shelters intact. The Germans noticed. In some places, they mocked the British with little boards offering to hand back the unexploded ammunition. Meanwhile, under the surface, another war was being fought. Royal Engineer tunnelers had driven at least 17 galleries beneath the German lines. In one of them, at Lochnagar, they packed 26 tons of explosive, enough to lift an entire hill. To Allied headquarters, after such a week and with mines of that power, no one could possibly have survived in the German trenches. In the concrete bunkers beyond no man's land, thousands of German infantry waited for the bombardment to end. At dawn on July 1, after 7 days of fire, an unnatural silence settles for a few minutes over the Somme front. Then, just before 0 hour, the ground erupts again. Beneath several German positions, the great mines laid by British sappers blow. At Lochnagar, 26 tons of explosive tear open a crater about 300 feet across and more than 65 feet deep. It is the signal. Among Allied headquarters, many are convinced that after such a bombardment and mines of that power, there can be no living enemy left ahead. At 7:30, along roughly 25 miles of front, 13 British divisions and 5 French divisions received the order to leave their trenches. In many sectors, British units advance in line, at walking pace, carrying 55 to 65 pounds of equipment: rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, rations. The distances to cover run from about 400 yards to more than a mile. To run would be suicidal. They would arrive exhausted. So officers order them to advance in good order, convinced they will find only ruins. Reality is different. In many places, the wire is almost intact, and German machine gunners have returned to their position within minutes of the barrage lifting. When the dark figures of the British rise from no man's land, Maxim guns and other German machine guns open fire along already registered lines. In some zones, the first waves are cut down within minutes. By day's end, the British Army has about 58,000 casualties, of whom nearly 20,000 are dead. Medical reports will say that only about 39% of the fallen were killed by rifle and machine gun bullets, while nearly 60% died under heavy artillery, often without ever coming within range of a German trench. Entire PALS battalions, men from the same town, the same factory, the same football club, are destroyed in a single morning. On the southern part of the front, however, the picture is different. Here, 5 French divisions attack, backed by more heavy artillery and with more limited objectives. In some sectors, they advance a mile or more, taking villages and several trench lines. They also suffer several thousand casualties on the first day, but far fewer than the British. For the Germans, overall, July 1 is a grim defensive victory, even though they themselves suffered about 10,000 dead, wounded, and missing. The line holds. The strength of their positions is confirmed, and at the same time it becomes clear that in a war like this, holding the front means turning the battlefield into a slaughterhouse for everyone. In the days after July 1, neither army stops. The British realize the clean breakthrough has failed, and the Somme turns into a series of local attacks, village by village. La Boisselle, Contalmaison, Mametz, Fricourt. Each advance costs hundreds, sometimes thousands of men for a few hundred yards of ruined fields and trenches. Between late July and August, two places were carved into the memory of British troops: Pozieres and Deville Wood. At Pozieres, on the ridge overlooking the road to Bapaume, 3 Australian divisions take turns. Within a few weeks, under constant shelling and German counterattacks, the Australians suffer about 23,000 casualties, almost as many as they had lost at Gallipoli in 8 months. The village and crest are taken, lost, and retaken in a spiral of blows and counterblows that grinds down men on both sides. A little farther east, in Deville Wood, a South African brigade receives the order to hold at all costs. About 3,000 go in. Only a few hundred will come out alive. For the Germans, too, the wood becomes a slaughterhouse. Assaults and counter-assaults cost them several thousand casualties in a few weeks. The wood is pulverized and renamed Devil's Wood. Overall, between July and August, German losses along the Somme sector rise to tens of thousands of men, comparable to British casualties over the same period. For the High Command in Berlin, it becomes clear that defense means more than companies erased, veteran non-commissioned officers lost, and divisions stripped from other fronts, even from Verdun, to plug the gaps and to keep the line intact. September 1916. After 2 months of attrition, Haig looks for a way to unlock the Somme with something other than yet another infantry wave. On September 15, in the Flers-Courcelette sector, he brings a new weapon into action for the first time: the tank. He had wanted 150 of them ready by July 1. In September, he receives 49. Many break down before reaching the start line. Others bog in the mud. In the end, only about 20 move forward with the infantry. These are Mark I machines, steel boxes crawling at 3 to 4 miles an hour, armed with 57mm guns or only machine guns in the lighter versions. For the British, they are still prototypes, full of flaws. For German infantrymen who suddenly see them looming out of smoke, crushing the wire and appearing above the trenches, they are a shock. In some sectors, frontline companies panic and pull back at a run. Yet the picture remains limited. Many tanks are stopped by artillery or by their own mechanics. Flers falls. The British advance a couple of miles, but the front does not collapse. Overhead, meanwhile, the Royal Flying Corps and the German Air Service confront one another with hundreds of aircraft. Reconnaissance planes correcting artillery fire, fighters dueling a few dozen feet above the ground. Here, too, the Allies gain local superiority, but nothing decisive. Tanks and airplanes show the future of war, but on the Somme in 1916, the present is still made above all of artillery, trenches, and mutual attrition. October brings rain and cold. The ground on the Somme, already pitted with craters, turns into a swamp. Tanks bog down, horses sink, and infantry slog forward in mud up to their knees. In spite of everything, the attacks continue. In mid-November, between the 13th and the 18th, the British attempt one last big push, the Battle of Ancre. Fifth Army finally takes villages such as Beaumont-Hamel, helped by the 51st Highland Division, and pushes forward a few miles. They pay with tens of thousands of casualties in a few weeks. The Germans, defending and then abandoning those positions, suffer a comparable number. By the end of November, after about 140 days of fighting, the Allied front has advanced only about 6 miles. No German collapse, no decisive victory, only 2 exhausted armies planted in the mud. Together with Verdun, the Somme pushed the war onto a scale of losses no earlier generation had seen. In about 4.5 months, the British lost around 420,000 men, of whom more than 120,000 were killed. The French lost about 200,000. German casualties ran between 450,000 and 500,000, a figure similar to, if not greater than, that of the Allies. In all, roughly 1 million soldiers were put out of action to move the front line about 6 miles. For Britain, the Somme was a national shock. The PALS battalions were cut down. Whole neighborhoods and towns lost in a few days. A generation of men. Yet it was also the baptism of fire for the new armies. From a small colonial force, the British Army became a mass army, able to sustain a long war of attrition. For Germany, the Somme was even more significant. One officer would call it the grave of our army. Entire divisions were consumed. Experienced NCOs and officers fell by the thousand, and reserves no longer sufficed. From then on, Berlin knew it could not win an endless war of attrition. Behind the lines, millions of shells were turned out in factories, often by women who had entered war industry in great numbers. Verdun and the Somme together were the most brutal demonstration of what trench warfare on the Western Front meant. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss any episodes. In the comments, tell us what struck you most. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It's the simplest way to support this project.